WNST sports beat every now and again to not just talk to politicians and local folks about local things, but nothing better for me than a good old-fashioned rock and roll conversation that involves Van Halen. And I don't even know how the hell this happens. The internet just works that way. But I found this guy, Greg Renoff, and he found me, and I shared some picture, and I think it had to do with Sammy Hagar and our mutual birthdays on the same weekend and me turning 50. And there's always the eternal question of Van Halen or Van Hagar. He wrote a book called Rising. It was a couple years ago that he did this, and you can find him out on Twitter at Greg Renoff. That's Renoff. Greg, I'm looking to find sort of this long-haired Jersey hippie dude. Instead, I find a PhD guy out in the middle of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and you find a sports radio goof in Baltimore who's got some fun old pictures and some old Van Halen stories and memorabilia as well. It's great to share the love of rock and roll when you and I aren't arguing about like Ravens and Jets or something. Right?
I totally agree. Yeah, it's been a long, strange trip since my days growing up in New Jersey, and we're probably about the same age. And I saw Van Halen on the 1984 tour, and it just made me a fan for life. I completely fell in love with the band, and life took its twists and turns. I ended up going to grad school, and I got a PhD in history, and I was actually teaching college and was looking for something that was going to be a little bit of a detour from my normal academic writing that I was doing for my career.
Like, what do you do in the real world? Like, when you say normal academic writing, like, dude writes a Van Halen book. I mean, I've written a couple of football books and whatever because I do sports things. But let me hear, like, some thesis of, I don't know, what archaeology or whatever you do. I don't know what you do.
Yeah.
You do history, right?
Yeah, so I'm a historian. So my grad dissertation was actually on traveling circuses of all things. And so the interesting thing is that I wrote this book about Van Halen. And, when I kind of got done with the book, I kind of realized that what I had done when I wrote my first book, which was on traveling circuses, was kind of channeled my experience as a kid going to these big rock shows, because I studied with these circuses, the big 3-ring, huge operations that were around at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. The shows that are long gone, but that would come and would put up a tent and 20,000 people would come. And
you mean like the freak show with the tall guy and the short guy, like all that, the carny, right? Literally, right?
The crowd watching and the huge spectacular shows. And I kind of realized that was kind of what I was doing. I wrote that book on circuses. And so fast forward to the Van Halen thing, it all kind of came full circle for me. So my academic training was in popular culture and mass entertainment. And so when I wanted to do a little bit of a detour, as I said, from my normal type of work I was doing as a professor, I circled back to Van Halen.
Why Van Halen? So, my background with Van Halen is they played the Baltimore Civic Center on 2. Then they came back in Women and Children, and, you couldn't get a ticket. And I was, 11 or 12, but, I was doing AC/DC then and some Rush and, some Ted Nugent. I mean, you Styx. I mean, you mix it up a little bit. But I didn't see them until 82, which sort of shocked me. And then Diver Down, and they were so awful. Like, even by my standards then, Roth didn't sing very well. And the whole Jack Daniels thing, and the drum solo, and the guitar solo, and the Marshall amps, and all that stuff. I loved Van Halen, but I didn't feel like it was like the greatest night out. And the sort of vaudeville place that Roth and his family came from sort of comes through in their music, and Just a Gigolo and all that stuff. But, I mean, there was no cooler thing on earth to say in 1982 or 83 or 84 than you were going to see Van Halen. And the strangest thing happened, and maybe as a sports fan when you part with your franchise, like when they were on the top of the top, they hated each other so much and couldn't get along, and there was so much drugs and alcohol, right, that the band broke up and got like a better singer, a better songwriter, a better everything, and sort of even 30 years later, people sort of still revolt, and I still have these awful arguments with old school people about Roth versus Hagar, and I love them both equally, but I would say that 40 years later, I've had a lot of beer, Roth, Hagar, Van Halen, never Sharon, by the way, that never comes up, but but it lends itself to saying, tell me the story, right? So, like, that's when you sit down and read a Led Zeppelin book or whatever the band of your choice is. I'm really looking forward to, like, pouring through your book because I read the Motley Crue book and all of that stuff, but to really research it at the level that you want to do it at, I remember where I was in my life at that period of time, but you forget, these were just long-haired guys that became sort of mystical in our youth, but 5 years earlier, they were like everyone else trying to figure it out because they paved the way, didn't they, Greg? I mean, there was no sort of card for what they did other than maybe some sort of remnants of Zeppelin and Aerosmith and Kiss, but music was sort of dying at that time, and I think people don't understand that, right?
Yeah, you know, what I tried to do with the Van Halen Rising book was to go back to the beginning and look at how the band formed. And so that was kind of my hook for it, which is that I felt like I knew a lot about, like you said, the Sammy Hagar era, the breakup, you know, the sort of the stuff that we read in Circus Magazine and kids, the rock magazines or MTV interviews. You kind of got all that. But I was really curious about how Van Halen kind of broke out so big in 78. So you're talking about 79 and 80, the Baltimore Civic Center. That was still when they were kind of on the rise. They were a big band, but they didn't become huge until the mid-80s. And so I went back and I interviewed hundreds of people who either worked with those guys back in Pasadena where they were from, promoted shows for them, people who they went to high school with, former bandmates of Ross before Ross joined Van Halen. He was in a group called Red Ball Jet. And so for me, I was really interested in how all of that came together to form this incredible rock band. And as you mentioned, you know, those guys in 73, 74 were playing backyard parties. They weren't famous. They were playing dive bars. I mean, they were playing for bikers in 1975 in Van Nuys, California. They weren't playing the Forum. They weren't playing arenas. And so they get discovered in 1977 by Ted Templeman, who ends up putting them on Warner Brothers record, and their album comes out. And I think the thing that you mentioned as well that's really remarkable to me is that when that record came out, soft rock is huge. The Eagles, Linda Ronstadt, Nicolette Larson, who Ted produced, those types of acts were really, really big. Disco, huge in 1978. Punk rock was seen as the next big thing. Obviously, the Sex Pistols were coming out of England, and there was all this sense that Blondie and all these groups that were playing the Sunset Strip were going to be really the next big thing in terms of dominating music. And it ended up that Van Halen was kind of an outlier. Even Ted Templeman, their record producer, who I interviewed for the book, said there wasn't a tremendous amount of confidence inside the halls of Warner Brothers about Van Halen. I mean, they were happy to put the record out, but it isn't something where anyone at the company was thinking, well, this is going to go double platinum by the end of 1978. And that's exactly what ended up happening. So it is this remarkable story when I kind of sat down and put it all together that these guys kind of came out of the backyards of Pasadena. They ended up getting a record deal after being passed over by so many famous people. I mean, even Bob Ezrin of Pink Floyd fame was given a tip on Van Halen, and he just couldn't get interested because there was a sense that sort of, like you said, that sort of hard rock sound was kind of dead. But
well, it was sort of limited. You know, they didn't see MTV, and they didn't see the teen idol part of this where every guy wanted to be them and every girl wanted to be with them. And, you know, even to Zeppelin with the lavish thing that they did, it felt like at that point a lot of guys were dying, let's be honest. You know, we're getting into 79 and 80. You know, I get more of a sense of it. So I turned 50, a week and a half ago, same weekend that Sammy Hagar turned 70, whatever it is. I've stopped counting with him with every shot at tequila. But, I look back on that and I say, when I watch vinyl and saw sort of the make-believe world of a label where they had black bands, country bands, old school Engelbert Humperdinck kind of bands, and they're trying to break Van Halen, and there was no real industry set up for music labels, right? Like from Plug-Ola and Payola on the radio, which was the only outlet, and whatever sort of hippie dope-smoking vinyl store was in your hometown with records in bags and whatnot. I mean, we're talking about the late 60s and early 70s. The industry, much like, I guess, the internet in our era, was not really set up for business so much. And in Southern California, like a band like that, you would see that. Totally is like a niche band to say they could never sell out stadiums because why would people be that interested in this band?
The thing that Ted Templeman told me, which is really a great story to kind of get this into context, is that when he, after he signed them, they had done the record wasn't out yet. So this is late 1977. He went to see them in Pasadena in October at a place called the Pasadena Civic Center. Held like, 2,000-3,000 kids. And he said it was packed with all of these local kids, and he said he was just amazed. Now, he'd seen them play a couple of shows at clubs, but he said they had all of these kids pumping their fists and singing Ain't Talking About Love and knew all the words to all the Van Halen songs, and he was just like, wow, these guys have really built a following, and he said it really gave him more optimism the record might break, because he said that there was clear that they had connected with the audience that they had at the time, which was just L.A. proper, writ large. That was the audience they could reach. He said that was really something that was really remarkable. But you're right. I mean, in terms of trying to figure out what's going to connect and what's not going to connect, it was not at all a guarantee that Van Halen was going to make it. Not at all.
But there was so much gimmickry, right? Like with Kiss and with Zeppelin and Aerosmith, the bands that had had some success at that point, and bombs going off and whatnot. But Roth, I don't think, not just the guitar and the drum and what Eddie was, but Roth selling it, right? Like literally like a professional wrestling, like Gorgeous George sort of kind of, right? Like selling it. And there's a whole background with him and his family in vaudeville, right? That really talks about maybe the complexity of when he wanted to go just a gigolo and do Beach Boys covers, and Eddie and Alex and Michael are like, dude, we're in a rock and roll band. Like, what are you doing, right?
The thing I think is really an insightful thing for people to pick up on about Van Halen is that when I talk about this in Van Halen Rising, when the Van Halen brothers first got on the radar of Roth, the Van Halen brothers were playing in kind of a Black Sabbath Cream cover band. And Roth looked at those guys, and Eddie was singing. They didn't do it. There was no show. It was just Eddie would stand there and play, and everyone was just blown away by how great Eddie and Alex and the bass player was.
Riffing Clapton probably at that point, and playing Smoke on the Water, right? Like literally.
Exactly.
Literally.
And so when Roth kind of gets those guys to sort of begin to think about letting him join, he's talking about how he wants there to be a show. He wants there to be danceable. And he ends up being that guy who comes in wearing no shirt and these pants that are tight. And
they were competing with disco, literally, right? I mean, that was...
Yeah. And the Van Halen brothers were not, at first, when they were, they're still just coming out of high school, they were not on board with this. They're like, this guy's a weirdo. I mean, we want to play in our jeans, basically. We want to dress like Nirvana when we play. And Roth kind of brought those guys to see the need for the show. And, of course, that's when you get that incredible musicianship that those guys had to be able to cover these songs note for note. When Eddie was even a young kid, like 18 years old, they could do these notes, these shows and these songs perfectly. And you getting Roth with, like you said, the vaudevillian entertainment. You bring those things together, that's how you get those spectacular shows. I mean, it really was this meeting.
Well, there was part of like Roth would like come out to the front of the stage and just stand and like point to the band as though he were like the leader, the conductor of the orchestra or something. That look at how great this band is, and by the way, Greg Renoff is here. I want to reset everything because he's written a book that you certainly should check out if you love rock and roll and love Van Halen. He's a PhD guy that does, more not Van Halen-y kind of stuff, but he's a Jersey lad who you can find at Greg Renoff out on Twitter as well. You're in Tulsa, Oklahoma, man. So I have a Tulsa story. I'm trying to do all 50 states. I've added Wyoming recently. I don't know what the hell's going to get me to North and South Dakota unless somebody shows up in Fargo. But I would say this. I went out to Tulsa, Oklahoma to see Rush open whatever the tour was 4 or 5 years ago on a stormy night, and they had done a Rolling Stone piece because they had done all the setup there. I was blown away by how nice of an arena Oil Money can build in Tulsa, Oklahoma, because that's as fine an arena as I've ever set foot in, and there's a real rock and roll thing going on there as well. As I understand that the Tom Petty story goes through Tulsa and a recording studio there as well. I mean, there's rock and roll. As much as you can do Abbey Road and go over and do it all and find out where Pink Floyd recorded albums, America's full of all of this too. And the Southern California story, not just the Eagles and Linda Ronstadt and Jackson Brown's side of that, but Van Halen launched every Poison and Motley Crue, and after that probably every Nirvana and Pearl Jam there ever was. They sort of set the stage for the second life of that. And again, Zeppelin and all those bands were British bands. This was an American band.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing. First of all, thanks for the kind words about Tulsa. As a person who's only been here for about a decade, I'm always amazed at the great history you can find. I mean, you kind of touched on it with there's a Church Studios here, which was owned by Leon Russell, and there's that, and there's also Kane's Ballroom, which is just an absolute legendary venue that goes back decades and decades, and everybody you can think of, back from country swing artists all the way up to punk bands, have played at the Cane. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the other thing about the Van Halen book, and that's how I kind of bring it full circle and end the book. I end the book in actually 1978, 79, and when they've kind of reached the pinnacle, the peak of breaking through. That's the thing I kind of try to touch on, is that how influential Van Halen is. I mean, I think that's really the testament to how important a band is. Obviously, is the influence. You know, we can look at the Beatles, Black Sabbath, all these groups, that Led Zeppelin, go down the line, were all these great bands, and Van Halen deserves to be in that category. If you look at the music that came out in the 1980s, now, you know, some of those bands maybe we might think are stronger than others, but there's no question that if you watched MTV in the late 80s, that Van Halen's influence was all over everything from Beat It, with the Eddie Van Halen solo on it, and all the stuff that followed from that, to, as you mentioned, the kind of pop metal glam groups like Poison and Winger and all these groups. They all borrowed something from Van Halen along the way, something.
Well, they sort of, in my youth, in the late 80s, I was the backstage guy at Hammerjacks, covering all of that mess, that glorious mess. As I always tell Steve Gorman, you know, when he came through the first time with the Black Crowes, that whole thing, right? Like everything that Hammerjacks and every Hammerjacks represents, but more than that, the whiskey and the strip and the aftermath of the Eagles and Linda Ronstadt and everything that Guns N' Roses and all of those bands from 84 through, even Aerosmith's revival and their second life and the aftermath of all of that. Somewhere in there's a Van Halen tree. And dude, to me, they become a little bit of a punchline, and we can get into all of that as well, into the modern era. And, I drank some wine with Sammy Hagar one day, and I know he and Michael Anthony are doing their circle, and I've only seen that act once, but I really want to get out and see them again, because I know they're doing Zeppelin, to do a bunch of stuff. And Sammy has lived this incredibly rich life where Van Halen is just this thing he almost doesn't want to talk about so much. But also, like, he came in and flew this, the fastest plane there ever was, and flew it better than it had been flown. And even then, there's this broken story of the brothers to say these guys should be sort of like the Beatles, but they could never get their manure together, right? Like, as people, there's also this broken story of the childhood stars that had everything Willy Wonka ever wished for and could never sort of keep it together as a business. But, I mean, Sammy sort of quit on the business of them, as I remember it, and the behind the music part of what really happened there, wow, that's peeling back a hell of an onion, too, there, if you want to tell a story, right?
The thing about Sammy, and this will bring back to the beginning of the conversation, it's really interesting. There aren't too many bands. You try to think about how many bands will people fight passionately about the different incarnations. I mean, even as big as Black Sabbath was, you don't see people on the internet at each other's throats about Dio and Ozzy. I mean, it just isn't, it just isn't part of the equation. And I think part of it is that the breakup with the brothers, with Dave, was so bitter. And then the success was so massive with Sammy. I think the thing that, even as a guy who grew up on Roth and would be a Roth first guy, it's easy to forget that when Dave went out on his first solo tour with Eat 'Em and Smile, and as big as successful as that tour was, he's only playing one night when he was going through these arenas, where Van Halen, when they came to New Jersey in '86, they played 3 nights. They played 3 nights at the Cow Palace, and that's like, that's upwards of 50,000+ people they're playing.
Dude, I covered all of that, right? Like, so I was a real reporter. I was backstage as a 17-year-old in Philadelphia drinking beer with Alex Van Halen and a very stoned Eddie Van Halen and a very enthusiastic Sammy Hagar. And they then literally would go on the stage and just, completely rip up 5150. There are 500 bras on stage. Sammy has bras wrapped around every part of his body like tourniquets, and they're holding up F Dave signs on stage in every city they would visit. And, the video from New Haven, Van Haven, as they would say, that's sort of legendary. But that thing went on, and it went on through 3 albums, 3 tours, 3 very good albums, by the way. And, at some point it took a turn somewhere else. And I guess this is where drugs and alcohol come into the story, and we cue the dark music and the behind the music part of this, because it really is sort of weird that bands like Rush and U2 have managed to hold it together. But, man, they are completely the exception to the rule, right? And this is where Van Halen sort of became a little bit more cartoonish in that way, and I find that to be a shame. I really do.
Well, as a Van Halen fan talking to a Van Halen fan, and hopefully lots of people out there listening to us are Van Halen fans too, it is sort of a tragic thing for me to look back in the last 20 years of Van Halen and think about all of the missed opportunities and the potential. You look at even someone who maybe isn't our first favorite group, either of us, is someone like John Hyatt, who's out there, who John Hyatt has written songs for everybody, and I'm sure he's got checks coming to his mailbox every day where he doesn't need to go out and work. But I saw him here in Tulsa, and he clearly loves to play. He loves to get out and play. He was playing for a couple hundred people. But he's a musician who wakes up every day and wants to create music that way. And it almost seems like with Van Halen, they're almost, kind of prisoners of their own success. It's almost like they're trapped by these different lead singers, and they can't figure out which incarnation they want to go forward with. And there was all these false starts along the way, and it's unfortunate, because I think back even to, from 1995 when you got Balance, you got Van Halen 3, and then pretty much all we got was A Different Kind of Truth and some greatest hits packages, and that's a lot of years where we could have gotten a lot of great music that just never really materialized.
Well, then there's the complicated part of Valerie Bertinelli and Wolfgang and Two Factions and the story that goes on. What happened after the end of the movie in 90 whatever has been more interesting, I think, in the modern era, because Sammy's incredible, right? Like, if you were to write the Sammy Hagar book about this guy in red and Three Lock Box and heavy metal and Can't Drive 55, and then joining this band and writing these incredible songs and these incredible tours, but then the whole tequila industry side of things, and really, Cabo as a place can be sort of linked to him in the same way that the Strip can sort of be, and Guns N' Roses can be linked to Van Halen. And Sammy's still like in his 70s, acting like he's 50. The time that I've spent with him, and it's been a handful of times and sort of weird times and places. I was at the little bar on the Wabarita tour, drinking the little drinks up on the stage. Did you see that show? But they made you sign a waiver that you could not take drugs or alcohol of any kind. So the drinks were actually like Blue Hawaiian Punch, which really kind of sucked because you couldn't even take beer on the stage. So it was like a sober Hagar show, which was cool. But either way, and I love Sammy. So I'm going to be a Sammy defender, but I don't hate Roth at all. I find him to be so wackily. And how about his story, trying to like be Howard Stern after? I mean, it's... And Valerie Bertinelli's on television every day, like making soup and stuff in her kitchen. It's wild how many roots this thing has. But I'm interested at this point. The only thing I'm interested in, when Hagar comes to town with Michael Anthony and they want to go out there and kick a little ass, that to me is still why I'm in this. That's why I'm vested as much as putting a CD on, or the first thing I do when I'm on vacation is I put 5150 on. True story. Or Van Halen 1. Depends on whether I'm feeling Roth or Hagar that day. But the only relevant thing left for this is to go see Hagar play, kind of, sort of, right?
Well, it's really a strange saga with the Van Halens. Even Wolfgang, Eddie's son, is so talented. He's finished this solo album. He's put out some posts on Instagram in the last 6 months saying it's done, and then yet there's not another word. It's about it, which is, I'm sure it'll come out. I'm not doubting it's going to come out, but it's sort of the Van Halen silence in facing the world is very. It seems almost very Zeppelin-esque back to the 70s, where that was kind of what Zeppelin, they kept the mystique about them, but we're living in a totally different age, and like you said, Sammy's out there. You can see Sammy on Instagram. You see him on Facebook. You see him on TV. You turn on Access. He's got his own shows, and he's got a totally different front-facing look at the world. And Mike with him out there with Jason Bonham playing these incredible shows. It's kind of the only outlet, really, if you're a Van Halen fan. If you want to kind of go out and celebrate the legacy of Van Halen writ large, you got to go see Mike and Sammy, because there's nothing else. As you said, Roth is sort of kind of disappeared off the radar as well. It's kind of it's strange. I mean, because to me, the one thing I think you and I both understand about David Lee Roth is that there's anybody who lives for the public adulation and for that sort of connection with people as an entertainer, it's Roth. And I'm just mystified at the silence that comes out of the Van Halen camp, and even Roth, who's just off the radar of everybody for months, years at a time at this point.
Well, these other bands like Kiss feed the brand. I mean, dude,
yeah.
Marley and Hendrix are like long dead, and their brand's sort of everywhere. Greg Renoff is our guest. Van Halen Rising is the book. You can find him out on Twitter, and we are discussing our mutual love of Van Halen. I've had long conversations about this in many, many ways, very rarely publicly, once in a while in a live radio spat on a quiet day when the Jets and the Ravens aren't beefing like you and I would be beefing normally, you as a Jets fan from Jersey. We would get into it a little bit, but I remember when the reunion thing happens, right? So, Kiss is doing their reunion thing, and by the way, I saw the videos of Ozzy this summer, and I almost got in the car to go watch him do Paranoid because it was really good, right? And I think we're at this point in our lives where you go out and you see Loverboy and you're like, not so good. And you go out and you see Roger Daltrey, and maybe it depends on the night. I've seen the Eagles be sort of sleepy over the last 15 years, and I've seen Lenny Kravitz be amazing. So, this in the last 6 months. So it's what would take me to a show? And I remember when Roth got back in the band with the short haircut and the whip and the Ellen DeGeneres video that continues to live. It still shows up sort of like a good Earl Weaver, going after the umpire rant for me when I need some comedy, when life is treating me wrong, when the guy leading our country said something else to offend me and I need some comedy, I can go to the Roth thing. But the brand is damaged, right? For those of us who had our notebooks and we would draw the V and the H,
yep.
and we would draw the logo on our, stencil it out or whatever. That's not something we all wear as a shirt and say Van Halen, because the last time we saw them, the movie wasn't so good, And as Kid Rock once said to my pal Jimmy Schwartz, no one loves a fat rock star, right? And I don't know, man. They've put it together in so many weird ways. It's kind of like going back to the beach you went to and nothing's the same anymore, and they kind of wrecked it to some degree, didn't they?
The thing, even to put aside the live performances, the thing that is always mystifying to me is that if you're a fan of any other band, and a real passionate fan, if you're an Eagles fan, if you're a Yes fan, a Rush fan, there is unlimited box sets and expanded editions. And even Van Halen has been so militant about saying we're only going to put out the original records and never go into the vault. And people tweet to me all the time on Twitter, Facebook, what Van Halen never going to release any more stuff out of the vault with Roth or Hagar, and there's just sort of this disdain for fans to say, you get what you get and you like it, rather than sort of, as you said, feeding the brand. Look, I mean,
there's no Van Halen channel on Sirius coming up with backtracks, but I mean, isn't part of that, honestly, that 82 Diver Down show that I did, and I shared this, Greg, and it's out on YouTube. Just put Largo in. The Capitol Center always pro-shot everything, so all the good boots of that era, literally all the great boots, are Capitol Center boots, and I was at half of those shows. I mean, the night Crespo and Dufay were falling all over each other, in front of Steven Tyler, stoned out of his mind. Those videos exist. The Roth Diver Down show that was my first Van Halen show, I snuck a camera in. I have my Pentax 110 photos of Eddie up on the Marshalls with the red and white striped guitar, a lot kind of blurry. But boy, it's so bad. You can't listen to it without laughing at it to some degree. Are there any good? I mean, was Roth ever really any good? Are there boots from 78 or 79 or 1 or 2 where he really went out and did it better? And maybe on the reunion tour, there were some nights early on where he sang, but by the time it got to Baltimore, dude, it stunk. It really did.
I'd say that a lot of that stuff, the later on stuff, I think the show became kind of paramount over the singing. But if you listen, you look on YouTube, you can find recordings from 78, 79 where Roth is dead on, and those guys are just focused in on putting on a show that's really, music as much as it is show. I think later on, I think part of that was shtick. I think part of that was just Roth kind of playing for the crowd. I'm drunk, and you look at this, and I'm drunk, even though I think we both know that you can only be so drunk and launch yourself 25 feet off a drum riser and land accurately. So, I think a lot of that was sort of played up for the crowd. But yeah, there's definitely recordings I think that they could put out from the early days. But I mean, I think there's some, there's a fair critique of that to say that, sort of the stuff at the US Festival, which is the other famous bootleg that was done in '83 that's all over YouTube. You can kind of see that those guys were definitely, I mean, that was a little bit more. I mean, the Roth is definitely a little bit shaky on that show, but there's stuff they could put out. There was definitely recordings they could put out from the studio and things like that. It's as you're kind of getting, I think, right to the heart of the matter when you're talking about this. It just seems like there's just a lack of care for the brand, and I don't quite understand why, but it's just that seems to be the way that the brothers, who presumably are the ones calling the shots in Van Halen these days, seem to want to run the operation.
He is Greg Renoff. He is a PhD historian and author of Van Halen Rising, and you can find him out at Greg Renoff on Twitter and find the book. Book's a couple years old now, and are you doing any more rock and roll stuff? I mean, is there any sort of epilogue to all of this to some degree that I think we can all agree it's done, right? I mean, we can all agree they're not going to the Grammys next year and putting the band back together and, having some Vegas stint where Sammy sings half the songs and Roth sings. I mean, they've even tried that, right? Where, like, they did a tour, like, sort of half-assed. Oh, they did do that, right? I mean,
they did.
It's crazy how many party tricks that they've pulled, right? Like WWE tricks.
I always say never, right? Especially with Sammy. I don't have any inside information about any reunion looming with Sammy, but I think Sammy's going to take his last breath on earth waiting for the call from Eddie. I mean, Alex, I think that's the reality. So you never know. I mean, as you said, there's been so many twists and turns in the story. In the mid 80s, it was Roth was the enemy. And then by, 2 decades later, Sammy was the enemy. So who knows? But, yeah, it's kind of hard to imagine that they're going to kind of go out and tour the world twice or 3 times ever again. But I'm working on the authorized biography of record producer Ted Templeman. And for those people who are maybe not aware of his name, he's the guy who produced all the Doobie Brothers records, and he did all 6 Van Halen records. He did the Roth Eat 'Em and Smile record. He did the EP with Dave, and then he worked on the For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge album with Andy Johns. And so Ted's going to tell us stories from his beginnings when he was a pop star in the late 60s in a group called Harper's Bazaar, and he'll take it all the way up to the end of his time at Warner Brothers and being an executive and working with James Taylor and Carly Simon and, again, all these other acts that I've already mentioned. So I'm really excited about that. Ted's a great guy, and he's got a great story, and so he's also going to kind of give his take on the whole Van Halen saga, and he's a guy who has a deep affection for the members of Van Halen and did the Sammy solo records too. He's the guy who's responsible for being behind the board for I Can't Drive 55 and Sammy's most successful solo record, VOA. So Ted's been deeply embedded in the whole Van Halen adventures over the years.
I got to meet and know Ed Loeffler a little bit before he passed many, many years ago. He was involved in their star, quite frankly, and I think I saw him. He was out with Jude Cole, who's now out with another band of his own at this point out of Colorado. But it's amazing, these people behind the scenes. Like, I had Desmond Child on the show recently and talking about Kiss and his name being on the credits and all of that, and everybody saw Ted Templeton's name, and that's part of the beauty of vinyl, and I think that's part of the beauty of being 50 years old, to look back and seeing the Colonel and what that meant for Elvis and what George Martin meant for the Beatles and stuff, that these stories get told later on, and it takes people like you to be interested to tell them at this point, right? And having an audience that wants to read about the behind the scenes with Van Halen.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the thing was that I got to know Ted through writing the Van Halen Rising book. He really helped me a lot with the book, and he's a guy who loves Van Halen, and he loved making these records. And so, yeah, for me, who used to listen like you to Fair Warning over and over and over again, and listen to every little sound and noise that Eddie did, and every little groan from Dave or little scream, and to kind of think about how those records got made and how they all came together and how the songs were put together and how he helped pick the songs and figure out which songs are going to go on which records. For me, it was really a great opportunity to kind of get that history down on paper. And as I said, Ted is a great guy who's got just a great career and a great legacy. And he's a a wonderful person. So it was an easy thing for me to want to do because I felt like that was, like you said, a history that was going to get lost if I didn't do the book.
You know, I would be remiss if I wouldn't say this. I hung out with Van Halen for a period of time, a couple hours before a show in Columbia in the early 90s, and Sammy was in the band, and Sammy had his girlfriend at the time, and Eddie was there but was kind of stoned, and Alex was sort of doing his thing. But Michael Anthony was like the good guy and the sort of the sober, normal one who was sort of... and he's sort of lost in the whole shuffle of all this, right? Like, we've just talked for 35 minutes about Van Halen and haven't talked about him at all. And I don't really know the story other than he golfed, he gets along with Sammy, he was the one thrown out for the kid. I don't know that I've read any dirt from him or anything like that. There's not a whole lot of dirt books, quite frankly, out on the band, and you've written more of a historical piece than sort of any sort of dirt or the drug part or the weird part, because no one's really explored a whole lot of that part, right? And Michael Anthony's the guy nobody probably asks much about. I bet he flies coach and not a lot of people know who he is, right?
Everybody who's ever met Michael Anthony I've ever talked to talks about what a great guy he is. I interviewed him for the Van Halen Rising book, and he was just, he's a guy who seems very unaffected by fame, and it seems like a person who's just understands that, hey, you know what, I've had a great life. I had a great fortune to meet the Van Halen brothers and get in this band, and it was a fantastic run. And, he's a guy who's not going to sit there and get mired down in the dirt, like you said, or the bitterness about, this person kicked me out of this group, or I didn't get this credit for this. And I have nothing but good things to say about Michael Anthony. And I think that's a universal feeling among Van Halen fans. And
did they all talk to you, by the way? Greg, you said you talked to Anthony. Did all the guys talk to you?
No, the Van Halen brothers and Dave took a pass on my book. And so
Hagar talked to you, though.
No, I didn't talk to Sammy because my book concludes in 78, 79, so I don't cover the entire stream of the Van Halen story.
Oh, okay, fair enough. I didn't get to the end. I told you I fingered through the beginning part of it, and it certainly, I didn't realize you sort of ended this thing before the flight took path.
Yeah, so the idea was to kind of do something like the Social Network movie or Straight Outta Compton, sort of like you make it, and then the book ends, and you sort of wait for the next chapter, in part because I'd already written 350 pages on their forming and their backyard party days, and then the whole 78 tour with Sabbath. So it was sort of, no one wants to read a Moby Dick on Van Halen. It was going to be like 700-page book. That was going to be a tough sell, I thought.
Are you a fan of those Moby Dick books? I mean, I remember reading The Dirt, the Motley Crue book, on a flight over to Europe, and it was written so strangely, from a passage standpoint, written from the perspective of these guys. And it was fascinating. My wife was in love with the Ozzy Osbourne book. She loved the Keith Richards book. And I didn't read the Keith Richards book. I just haven't been all that interested, but I've read Zeppelin books, and I read I've read Styx's book, Chuck's book. So, some books I'm drawn to and some I'm not. I don't know how much of the dirt the fans want to know. Stevie Gorman is writing a book about the Black Crowes and how messed up they are. I think that's more titillating, right? I mean, it's more titillating to go back and say, tell me the dirty stories of all that. That's kind of what the public wants to know, right?
For me, I felt like that was just gotten so played out. I didn't think it was my place to write the book like that, and I wasn't going to anyway. But sort of after The Dirt, I always feel like it's like, how much more could you possibly put out? I mean, it's like we all know the sort of stuff that rock stars do, and it's sort of have that replicated in book after book after book.
After you snort ants, right?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Exactly. And so it's all, for me, I wanted to kind of give a musical view of how those guys got their influences and how we got the Ross sound with the Van Halen sound together in the group. And so I was less, there's definitely a little bit of sex, drugs, and rock and roll in my book, but that's sort of just a bump in the road along the way rather than sort of the main narrative. But
that is a big part of the story, the sex, drugs, right?
There's no question. I guess I'm just trying to say is that the book that I ended up writing wasn't sort of one of these exposés where you sort of try to dig up every story where such and such was passed out, puking in a toilet backstage and doing coke with strippers or something. And it just wasn't the type of thing. But yes, you can't leave out sex, drugs, and rock and roll out of the Van Halen story and expect to get it right. So yeah, there's that stuff's in there. It's The Dirt is sort of it's almost like a model onto itself of how to write a rock book. It's a great book. I love it, so.
Well, right, and you know, we all sort of pattern things. Last thing for you on the Van Halen side of things, because this probably is of that era, and I just Googled it and I found it, and even though McDonald's isn't a sponsor, never has been, and I don't eat there very much, I was walking through the Hard Rock in Vegas, a decade and a half ago, and they had, obviously all the art up, and there was one incredible picture of Van Halen in one of the floors of David Lee Roth and Eddie Van Halen, very young, in a parking lot on a snowy day with old station wagons in the background, eating, 29-cent cheeseburgers, out of the bags with all the old, and they have their rock star hair going on, but they're freezing their ass off because they're in the middle of Michigan or wherever they were. And, those pictures, now I Googled them, and I found about 15 different ones. At that time, I just thought, man, that's the real story. The real story is they were in a van, not a bus. The real story is they had the costumes that they put on when Circus came, of them with a Jack Daniels bottle in a bathtub. But in order to figure that out, there were a lot of Highway 29s from Dubuque on the way to Cedar Rapids and trying to figure this out.
I think, that picture, I know exactly the picture you're talking about. So those pictures were taken in March 1978, and understand, when you look at those pictures, look what they're wearing. They're wearing Army surplus parkas. I interviewed one of the guys who went out on the road with them, one of their roadies, along with Pete Angelos, by the way, who ended up managing the Black Crowes later. But that was that was band issued clothing. It's like, there was no big money budget. It was like, let's go to the Army Navy store and buy winter coats because we're going to be going to North Dakota in February.
And dude, by the way, if you get a sinus infection in Chicago and we got to play in Detroit on Thursday, I mean, there's a whole part of propping these guys up when, let's be honest, there was a lot of mafia money, going through these clubs and through these promoters back in the 70s. Nobody wanted to disappoint a man who had $350,000 in a drawer and 18,000 rabid kids out there.
Right.
Dude, your fingers are bleeding. Edward, play the guitar, right?
Yeah.
Literally, right?
Yeah. I mean, that was the thing. They played something like 180 dates on that tour. It was, they went out from February to December. You can imagine how road-worn and how zombied you are after, a stream of endless hotel rooms, and you have to go back to Pasadena, then go straight to Hollywood and make a new record, make Van Halen 2. So that was the sort of the concluding part of the book. And at that point, they left Pasadena. No one outside of Los Angeles in early '78 knew who they were, really. They got home, and they were international stars. They'd been to Europe, to the UK, to Japan. They'd been all over the world, and they were double platinum artists and stars. It was an incredible run for those guys, an incredible rise out of obscurity to fame.
Dude, a pleasure to know you and have you on the program. Next time I'm in Tulsa, we'll find a great breakfast place or something. You can take me to that awesome theater, and we'll figure it out. And it won't be a Rush show, sadly, my heart breaks. Doesn't it suck getting old? Skinner's coming through here in a couple of weeks, and it's like sort of Skinner, but not. And Kiss is doing their thing, but I'm sure 25 years from now, 4 dudes in makeup will be doing it on a stage somewhere with exploding bombs and blood and swords and all sorts of stuff. But that's kind of where we are, man. I mean, aging sucks. It just does, right? Literally.
It's aging sucks, except for everyone like Sammy, who's out there at 70 years old and still doing the same stuff he did when he was 30.
Dude, you know what? That's where we should convene. You and I should find ourselves in Chicago somewhere, ripping it up with Hagar and Anthony one night before we get too old to enjoy it. And I promise you, dude, it's very disappointing that a guy who made $50 billion with tequila would put me on stage and serve me blue Hawaiian punch. But he did make it right one day in a wine cellar in Napa, so we're even. And I brought that whole thing up. So, but we're cool. A pleasure. Greg Renoff is our guest. Van Halen Rising is the book. He is much smarter than me and writes deeper material and teaches young people things. All I do is talk about sports, and you're a Jets fan, so you get to talk about it for like 5 or 6 weeks a year, and then reality sets in around Halloween, right?
It's your show. I'll let you have the final word on that one.
Sam Darnold, Jets, Jets.
Love it.
Take care, Greg. Be well. Thank you.
Hey, thanks a lot.
You got it. Greg Renoff, Van Halen Rising's the book. Google it, find it. How a Southern California backyard party band saved heavy metal. Great chat with Greg Renoff, PhD historian and author of Rising. Not bad for a guy from Jersey. Not like those other guys from Jersey, those Springsteens and Those Bon Jovi guys. I am Nasty at WNST.net. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram. I'm going to start mixing some of these chats in with my best of rock and roll chats and my old chats with David Bowie and Billy Joel and John Bon Jovi and all that stuff that I play around here once a year when we sort of celebrate getting old and I need a week off from sports. But you can find me out on Twitter and on Facebook and on LinkedIn and all those other places, usually doing some rock and roll whenever, I don't know, Stevie Wonder comes to town or my wife drags me to a Bruno Mars show or somebody puts the band back together. Gorman's putting Trigger Hippie together, so maybe we'll have that next year to have some fun with. Nasty at WNST.net is my place. I'm out on the buyatoyota.com audio vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device by downloading the TuneIn Radio app. We do come in crystal clear from anywhere in the world. I'm Nestor. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 at WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.